Halloween party. Alright, the end is nigh as I take on the third to last Poirot novel released, Halloween Party. I was definitely curious going into this one because the title suggests much potential, so it's one that I've kind of been looking forward to for a while, ever since I heard the title, you know. So I was pleased to find when I started reading that unlike some other novels that tantalize readers with falsely thematic titles, Hercule Poirot's Christmas, in this novel our characters, right from the start, are actually in the midst of setting up for a Halloween party. We get a chance to experience all the traditional party games before, of course, the inevitable murder mystery begins as a body turns up drowned in a bathtub, a bobbing for apples bathtub. Actually, I guess it's not a bathtub, it's the tub you use for bobbing for apples. The only problem is that's about all the Halloween that we actually get in this novel. It's over in the first 15 minutes, and while we will mentally revisit the crime scene from time to time, nothing else in this novel will remain true to a Halloween or even an autumn theme. The most evocative other descriptions we get involve characters admiring gardens. Feels like a bit of a missed opportunity here, a bit of a letdown from the author who managed to create the thoroughly sinister atmosphere of And Then There Were None. That said, thinking about this novel as a whole, it does have more of a cohesive overall setting and feel to it than many Christie novels. Here I can imagine all the characters walking around the village and getting into all the suspicious activities that we learn about as the story develops. That's not to say this novel isn't macabre, it's just not so in a traditional Halloween-y sort of way. In some ways, this is one of the darkest Poirot novels I've read, lacking any of the everything will be alright, really, sense that we feel in some of the earlier novels. First of all, the victim is a child, killed at what was supposed to be a fun party in a rather disturbing way, beyond the fact that it's going to be disturbing regardless. Worse than that, though, Papa Poirot and most of the other people we interview have pretty much no compassion for the victim, all of them remembering her as a rather nasty girl and a compulsive liar. And Poirot even makes a similar comment later, which I won't say here because it would be a slight spoiler, but feels totally heartless and quite disappointing, actually, hearing him say this. Basically, despite this novel involving characters described to us as children, most of them are not really convincing as children, and no one in the novel really seems to treat them with the patience that children should be treated with, for that matter. They're expected to have the maturity and responsibility of adults, which also carries with it the unfortunate reward of all of them being fair game as murder suspects. The investigation process in this novel is somewhat unconventional and a bit convoluted. I found it somewhat frustrating to follow as I was reading this novel, but now looking back on it, it's not really so bad, but I wish I'd just been more mentally prepared for the direction of exploration that this novel was going to take. And in some ways we are adequately prepared. You see that the reason the girl was killed is ostensibly related to a comment she made at a Halloween party that she'd witnessed a murder. So we assume it's someone silencing a would-be witness. So obviously any proper investigation is going to look into not only people who were there at the party and heard her make this statement, but also is going to involve raking up some scandalous and presumably murderous stories from people's past. So we get a situation sort of like what was set up in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, where we're looking into a series of past crimes to see which ones might be related to a present crime. And we know this from pretty early on. The part that frustrated me while I was reading it is that it felt rather non-linear and therefore sometimes rather confusing. A bit like the sort of memory puzzle rather than mystery puzzle, like what I experienced when I read the Miss Marple novel Murder at the Vicarage, although that one has a lot of merit to it for other reasons. And yet, looking back on this non-linear development and comparing it with Mrs. McGinty's Dead, in which the news articles and photos of potentially disguised criminals are actually like simultaneously laid on a table for us, we read the blurbs and we're told that there may be one or two errors in them. The way that it's done in Halloween Party feels a lot more seamless, so I have to commend Agatha Christie on doing something fairly innovative for her in how she lays out this mystery that involves raking up the past. I also found fairly early on that I was fairly confident in the outline of what had happened, and I was very much on track. And yet at times, Christie seemed to spin things in a way that suggested otherwise and seems a little bit unfair to me. It's hard for me to say. I'd have to really revisit those excerpts to be certain. I'll say more on that in the spoiler-filled second half, but all in all, I think I'd have to say that the mystery plot was pretty well done here. In spite of these complimentary things, I have to say, at the time I was reading the novel, I didn't find myself enjoying it enormously. And maybe some of it was my own fault, as I previously mentioned. that I found the exposition of the mystery a little awkward, despite thinking in hindsight that it probably was fine. But I think also part of it is that certain non-mystery aspects of the novel become irksome enough to me that they started to diminish my enjoyment. Some of those are spoilers, but as I mentioned already, this novel does not feel fun, even in a way that a novel like Dead Man's Folly seems to feel, despite its also grim subject matter. Well, they're all about murder, but yeah. There are too many characters that aren't fully brought to life, and some of those are fairly important to the plot. And in particular, as I mentioned before, the kids in this novel are not permitted to simply be kids. So much is expected of them by the adults around them, including those like Poirot, who should have more compassion. Even beyond that, there's sort of a sense in the novel, and arguably throughout other novels later in the Poirot series as well, that unlike the mysteries of the earlier days in which murders felt like disruptions of the natural order, exceptions to the rule of normal decency and civility, the world has now become simply so saturated with crime that basically nothing is surprising or shocking anymore. The ruthless murder of a young child is underwhelming to the police amidst a backdrop of wider theories about sex crimes and psychotic maniacs, which also no longer carry their former connotation of comic relief to the reader, of illustrations of just how far off the mark our local police force can be. They're becoming more and more like actual serious suggestions, when we actually have to dignify them and rule them out by evidence. It's as if Christie has been writing about so much crime that now her world actually is a world full of crime. Or maybe she's just reading the news, which will probably do the same thing to you. And maybe this is what I should expect as someone who reads about crime, like maybe a fun murder mystery has always been in itself a bit of a contradiction. But I guess if I wanted to enter that world, I could read some hard-boiled detective novels, which paint the picture a lot more clearly and directly than Christie is doing here. So in some ways, but not all, this novel grew on me only with a bit of distance. At the time I was reading it, I considered it among the bottom 25% of Poirot novels, and maybe I still do, but it's not obvious to me, at least, that it belongs there. Certainly it belongs in the bottom half, and quite possibly in that bottom 25%, but I have to at least think about it, unlike, well, I won't get ahead of myself there. And it must be emphasized here that we're talking about a novel from an author whose works I just generally do enjoy reading. And I've taken on the mission for this author of reading all of her works in their entirety, or at least the Poirot novels, so bottom 25% is not as much of a condemnation as it would be in other contexts. I actually did still really enjoy reading this book. Also, while reading the novel, I was aware that about the same time I was reading it, there was a new film in theaters based on it, A Haunting in Venice, which initially I found a little bit puzzling because this novel is not in Venice, but I guess it's the haunting part that's supposed to be the connection with that movie. And okay, I probably will watch that film someday, but I wasn't really in any rush to get there. I've seen the other two Kenneth Branagh film adaptations, and although I found something to appreciate in both of them at the time, I was left feeling with both of them that they were truly lacking in some pretty important way, and that opinion has only been reinforced now that I've watched the David Suchet Poirot series, which typically are right on point for me. But alright already, let's get to the spoilers. This is your first and final warning. So I actually more or less figured this mystery out, in some regards. I didn't determine that Michael Garfield was involved, and I certainly didn't discover that he was Miranda's father, because honestly that was another one of these cases of who needed that, and totally uninteresting family relationship that's revealed right at the ending. One interesting point in this mystery is that the murder victim is a compulsive liar, and pretty much everyone you ask agrees on this point, so we actually can believe it. But why then would anyone care about silencing her, since she can say whatever she wants, even something true, and no one will believe her? This is a fair point, and I think one that isn't totally cleared up, but I also think I got a little too hung up on it as a clue. It seems to be simply the fact that since there were elements of truth to the story she was telling, the girl Joyce was obviously aware of something she shouldn't have seen, and that makes the killer want to silence her, since there's no way that this seemingly fanciful tale can somehow be verified at a later point if she's dead. Honestly, this whole compulsive liar thing sort of works, but it feels a little bit more like a misdirect, but one that we know is a misdirect within the context of this novel, rather than a truly ingenious clue. At the end of the day, it just forces us to make a leap to her having stolen the story from someone else who's not present, which I certainly didn't figure out, and I think most readers will probably not, although correct me in the comments if I'm wrong there. A more meaningful clue, if you happen to be thinking along the right lines, is the clue of the wet floor or the vase with the spilled water. Rowena Drake is at one point witnessed to have dropped a full vase of water, presumably due to being startled, although the account given by the witness seems to imply that she was quite aware of her surroundings, although she didn't realize she'd been detected standing there. And therefore, it seems kind of hard to believe that she was randomly and suddenly started. Like, it sort of seems like she dropped this vase on purpose for some reason. Combined with this immediately unexplained and suspicious behavior, my mind then moved towards the fact that dropping this vase made a mess of water, which obviously would be helpful for the murderer because it would obfuscate any signs of water from the apple bobbing tub in the crime scene that would help us to identify the person who committed the murder, who was wet, or any signs of water on the floor if a body had been moved or something like that. So the obvious conclusion from this part is that this obfuscation is either an unfortunate coincidence, which we can't totally rule out, unfortunately, in a Christie novel, but we can hope is not the case, or it's an intentional cover-up of something. So I suspected from that point forward, which this point was made pretty early on in the narrative, that Rowena Drake was involved and at the very least was trying to shield someone from suspicion if that was not herself. I think I also like that the will was an important piece of the puzzle, although I think this was a little bit more transparent than most clues, at least in the fact that it seems so obvious what happened from the story that we're told, that is that the deceased woman's assistant Olga must have forged the will, that it obviously must not have been that way. Not because there exists obvious evidence to the contrary from the start, but because this is a mystery puzzle. And this clue in particular is especially strong in implicating Rowena Drake, because she's otherwise the beneficiary of this will. Finally, there was also some implication that Rowena Drake may have killed her husband, which I think was never confirmed or refuted, but which was also a suspicious point against her for sure. Now, with all this stacking up in my mind against Miss Drake, there are some times in this book in which I feel like we were manipulated just a little too blatantly, because I thought, as reading certain passages, can this really be? Because it seems to me that she's being released from suspicion here, but also she's clearly the one indicated still. And indeed, it was her in the end, or her and another person. Supposedly, this dissonance can be explained in that she's simply very crafty and an extremely compelling liar. I don't know, maybe that's true. I just didn't feel like the characterization of this novel was quite strong enough to really convince me that this is Miss Drake's character, as it was in some past Poirot novels where this personality aspect really comes into play as a clue. I don't really have much to say about the other characters, though, because with Miss Drake in mind and with clear motives, at least for her forging of the will, even if we haven't connected the whole chain of how that means she needs Joyce Reynolds silenced, none of the other characters really emerged ever as a convincing alternative. In fact, since there are a lot of characters in this book, most of the characters don't even receive enough time in the spotlight to really even develop them enough to be a satisfying solution to the whodunit question. And for me, that was unfortunately somewhat true of our other murderer, Michael Garfield. Garfield is unmasked as the second criminal in a long and melodramatic sequence towards the end of the book that could be one of the worst sequences in all of the Poirot novels, involving an attempted ritual sacrifice of his daughter, Miranda. And yes, that's another exciting twist to this scene, learning that Miranda is Michael's daughter. An exceedingly unlikely coincidence, which really adds nothing to the story, but I'll leave it at that. In my reading, Garfield was basically somewhat undercharacterized during the novel, and therefore we have to endure this whole passage of psychoanalysis at the end, with Poirot explaining to us how not only is Michael Garfield obsessed with creating gardens, which we have been shown at this point, this also supposedly illustrates that he's a clinical narcissist, if that's such a term. Enter some allusions to Greek myth of Narcissus, and how Poirot, who himself is named after a Greek hero, Hercules, immediately notices that the gardener Garfield's resemblance has a resemblance to Narcissus. Also, this whole ending sequence is written in such a laughably awkward way, basically designed to prevent us from knowing until the last possible moment that Michael Garfield is the one implicated, even though we all know it's him because he's the only male suspect. Aside from the profoundly unserious youths who are technically suspects, but who are portrayed as being just so ridiculous as to render them incapable of executing any crime of consequence. This ending is just bad, and it's probably one of the reasons I was left with a bad taste in my mouth immediately upon finishing this novel, despite it having some enjoyable aspects to it. A bad taste, but not such a bad taste as to discount the merits of the novel entirely. Looking back on it, it was in total still a positive reading experience. And I wonder if we'll be able to say the same of the next novel, Elephants Can Remember. Yeah, if you've read that one, which I actually already have by now, you know the answer to this already. So see you then. And until then, happy reading.